Hello, this is Jason Clement, Technical Sales Manager at Isonas, and welcome to the Certification Training Module. This module is Plug and Play, Configuration Tool, and Controller Supervisors, or CSUPs. Our course objectives are: cover addressing and the communication of Isonas devices to both DB Crystal and Pure Access, cover Controller Supervisors for DB Crystal, what their purpose is, and how to create them, cover DB Plug and Play utility, the configuration tool, and the basic configuration of an Isonas device. Isonas devices can use either static or DHCP addressing. For DB Crystal installs, you should use static addressing whenever possible. When doing a Pure Access install, it works best with DHCP. Isonas devices can act either as a server or a client. DB Crystal installs should use server mode whenever possible. In server mode, the DB Crystal server will initiate the connection to the Isonas device. Pure Access uses only client mode. When the devices are in client mode, a server address is programmed into the device. The device will then try to initiate the connection back to the Pure Access install. By default, a device will try to gain a DHCP address. If it's unsuccessful, it will revert to an IP address in the 192.168.1 range. The DB Crystal configuration settings here override anything in any of the previous or prior videos or the software manual. There may be other references to using DHCP with DB Crystal and using call home functionality with DB Crystal. This can be done, but if you want to use either of those settings, please contact technical support or pre-sales support to help you set those up correctly. DB Crystal works best when using static addresses and server mode. Controller supervisors actively communicate with Isonas devices, RCO3s, and IP bridges. Multiple controller supervisors can be running to communicate with groups of devices for logical segmentation. For example, here we have Atlanta, Boulder, and Tampa all on their own controller supervisor. The recovery supervisor handles Isonas devices that lose communication. You'll never see any devices under the recovery supervisor, and don't try to install any new devices under that recovery supervisor. Each supervisor operates on a specific TCP port. Here we can see 7071, 7074, and so on and so forth. If you remember the ports from our network module, these are very important for communication between the server and the device. When you have large systems, the controller supervisors need to be balanced. Really, any system, they need to be balanced. There should be no more than 50 doors on one CSUP and no more than 30 CSUPs overall. However, if you have a 50-door system, don't just create one CSUP and jam all the 50 doors underneath that one CSUP. DB Crystal works better and more efficiently when they're spread out. So create 5 CSUPs and put 10 doors underneath each CSUP so that it works more efficiently. Plug and Play, or the Isonas configuration tool, finds Isonas devices on the network and configures them to communicate with DB Crystal or Pure Access. The difference between Plug and Play and the Isonas configuration tool is that Plug and Play is installed along with DB Crystal and needs a connection to that actual database. You can't just run Plug and Play alone on a standalone PC. The Isonas configuration tool is a small download from our site that can find the devices and configure them to communicate with DB Crystal or Pure Access. So if you're using a DB Crystal install, then you can just use Plug and Play as it's already installed. If you're doing a Pure Access install, you'll probably just want to use the Isonas configuration tool as you don't want to download and install DB Crystal. It finds the devices through broadcast messages on the subnet that PC is running the application is on. Whenever possible, do this in your lab, test bench, or other controlled environment for ease of install. You don't want to be out in the field installing 100 of these devices and then trying to assign the address there and finding that you have connectivity issues. Remember, DB Crystal works best with static IP addressing and in server mode. So how does it work by default? The Isonas device is in server mode and will try to acquire a DHCP address by default purchased from the factory. If it fails, it'll revert to an IP address in the 192.168.1 range. There are some older firmwares out there that will revert to a 169.254.something.something link local IP address. If it successfully attains an IP address, and you've configured it for client mode, it will then start to call home to that address. For example, isonaspuraccesscloud.com. If it successfully attains an IP address, but you set it to server mode, it will wait for DB Crystal to initiate a connection. So, if you accidentally set a device to client mode and you try to connect it to DB Crystal, it will not connect. And vice versa, if you set a device to server mode and try to have it connect to Pure Access, it will not connect either. Now let's see how all this works together. Right, so let's go ahead and open up Plug and Play. A password of a password, all lowercase. So we'll review both the configuration tool and Plug and Play. The configuration tool is the easiest method. Plug and Play can be used, but it requires the full DB Crystal installation. So if this is a Pure Access install, your best bet would be to use the config tool. As previously mentioned, it's always best to do this in your lab and not out in the field. In my home office, I have a DHCP server and my network uses 192.168.1.something scheme already. If you remember, this is the same IP address scheme that the reader will default to if it doesn't get a DHCP address. I recommend the same setup for your lab. You can pick up a cheap SMB router with DHCP and use it to set up your devices before installing them in the field. So once you've opened up Plug and Play, you want to make sure that you're broadcasting out on the right network segment. If your device has multiple network interfaces, you'll have multiple IP addresses listed here. So you just want to make sure that you choose the correct IP address that you're broadcasting out on. I only have one, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave that chosen. Go ahead and click the Find button to refresh any devices on the network. And here we can see that I've got one IP address listed in red, this 172.16.0.5. I assigned this a static IP address on purpose so that it's outside of our range so that we could see what it looks like in DB Plug and Play. I'm going to go ahead and open up the configuration tool. Configuration tool works the same as DB Crystal, just a lot more streamlined interface. So I'm going to go ahead and click Discover Units. One thing to notice about the configuration tool is it does not highlight any devices that are outside of our IP range. So this 172.16.0.5 is not highlighted in the configuration tool, and we will not be able to assign it an address with the configuration tool. So make sure you take that into account. Again, if you're doing this all in your lab, it shouldn't be a problem. However, if you're doing it out in the field, then this could be a potential issue. I'm going to go ahead and close this out because you can't really have the configuration tool and DB Plug and Play running at the same time. So in Plug and Play, I'm going to go ahead and change the IP address of this device that's been addressed with a different network segment. First thing I want to do is go down here and I want to manage an IP address pool. Usually you're going to have multiple devices, and if you use DB Plug and Play, you can just create an IP address pool and it'll just pull the next available address from that pool to assign to the device. So I'm going to go ahead and create one, 192.168.1.70, and then 192.168.1.79. So that's a nice range of 10 IP addresses. Now that we have that pool assigned, if we go down here to our IP addressing, you can see that the new IP address is 192.168.1.70, the first available IP address in that pool. I'm going to go ahead and assign a subnet to it of 255.255.255.0 and also a gateway 192.168.1.1, which is all the correct information. Then down here, I want to make sure that we disable DHCP. We're going to be connecting these to DB Crystal and DB Crystal-like static addresses. So we're going to go ahead and assign the static address and make sure that DHCP is still disabled. From here, I can just click the change button now with this device highlighted. And it's going to say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I am definitely positive. I've got the reader sitting right here next to me and I can hear it going through its rebooting process. And it's already rebooted. So one quick tip, if your device is set for DHCP and it's not getting a DHCP address, it will take a long time to boot, between 30 and 60 seconds. So now I can see that my Isonas RCO3 is set to 192.168.1.70, just like we wanted it to. A couple other things that you can do under DB plug and play is we talked about a thing called server and client mode. DB Crystal, like server mode, and Pure Access needs client mode in order to work. If you're using DB plug and play to program these devices to connect to Pure Access, there's another step that you have to take. We can connect to the device with the connect button there as long as we're on a valid subnet. Go down to my configure tab right below that. Now I can see a couple key things. One, my enable DHCP is unchecked, meaning that I'm using a static address. I can see my static address here, my subnet mask, and my gateway. And then down below here, there's a type, a server or client mode. We're using DB Crystal, so we're going to leave this in server mode. However, if we wanted to connect this device to Pure Access Cloud, we would have to put it into client mode. So once I move it to client mode, then I'm going to type in a remote host name. So for Pure Access Cloud, you're going to put in something like Isonas pureaccesscloud.com or something similar, whatever's been assigned to you via your license. And then you're going to want to put in a DNS IP address. For example, here I could put in 8.8.8.8, which is a free Google DNS. Those items are critical for connecting to Pure Access. You must have it in client mode, you must put in a remote host name, and you must put in a DNS IP address. Now, if you're using Pure Access Manager, you have a server on site, you're just going to populate an IP address in here. For example, 192.168.1.203 could be my Pure Access server, and I wouldn't worry about the name, I would just delete that out of there. However, just remember, that's for Pure Access. We're using DB Crystal, so we're going to leave this in server mode. So I'm going to go ahead and just disconnect this because we're not making any changes. If I did want to connect this to Pure Access Cloud, I would make my changes and I would hit set, which would push the settings down and reboot the reader. So here I'm just going to disconnect. So we've gone over the configuration for DB plug and play. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. So you want to go up to Options and click Stop Execution. If you just close this out, it will still continue to run in the background and you'll have to go to your task manager to actually kill the application. So just do yourself a favor, go up to Options and click Stop Execution. So let's go ahead and open the configuration tool back up. Click Discover Units, and we can see our 192.168.1.70 is already configured for us from Plug and Play. Now if we're using Pure Access and we're using DHCP, we really don't need to go any further than this screen. We can just choose our Pure Access Cloud address and click Configure All Units, and it will take care of everything for us. If we're doing Pure Access Manager and we need to type in an IP address, we just specify a host IP address. Example again, 192.168.1.203 may be my Pure Access Manager. However, if you need to change any other settings, for example, you want to do Pure Access and static addressing, because yes, you can still use static addressing, it's just DHCP is a lot easier. We're going to want to click Advanced Settings. So Advanced Settings allows us to change from client to server mode. It gives us some more information about our host address if we're using client mode, and it allows us to do DHCP or static addressing. We're doing a DB Crystal install, so we want server mode and static addresses. So I'll change this to server mode. Note that the host IP address box will go away. And we'll go ahead and choose static. I'm going to go ahead and populate an IP address in here. Our subnet and our gateway. Go ahead and highlight the device I want to change and click Configure Selected Units. So the device will reboot. It's got a static IP address, so it'll boot up fairly quickly. And then I'll go ahead and change the remaining devices. Okay, so now if we take a look at our IP addresses, we can see that everything has been addressed. Go ahead and close this out now that we've got everything set up. It was static IP addresses and in server mode, and we'll click Close. Now we'll open up dbadmin with a password of, again, a password. And we have our network tab up by default. We can see our recovery supervisor. If we click on the controller network up here and then right click on it to insert a new controller supervisor, I'm just going to leave this called Supervisor 02. If this is a production environment, if you're installing it out on somebody's site, you're going to want to click Run Supervisor as a Windows service. Otherwise, you're going to install this, you're going to start the controller supervisor, and sometime or another that PC or server is going to reboot. The controller supervisor will not start up unless you check Run Supervisor as a Windows service. This is just running on my demo system, so I'm not going to check it here, but remember, in a production system, you'll want that checked. Supervisor ID is 02 for Supervisor 02, and we'll just leave our port at default. Now, I briefly mentioned being able to do call home with DB Crystal, which you could do here by enabling the server and choosing a server port. Again, there are certain scenarios where you may want to use that, where it's beneficial, but please contact tech support or pre-sale support for assistance in setting that up. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And I'll just go ahead and throw another supervisor in there, and by default it's going to name it 03. Now let's go ahead and click OK. So I'm going to go ahead and start these up. Give it a few seconds to refresh, and now we can see we have blue check marks, meaning that everything is running fine. We have the supervisors created. Now we just need to add devices underneath them. So I'm going to go ahead and use Supervisor 02 for my RCO3s. I'm going to go ahead and insert my first one here. We're going to call this Office Door Number 1. Notice over here, server client mode, we're in server mode, so we're going to leave it there. We are not using DHCP, so that is unchecked. And now we just need to change the connection IP address. 1.60 is my first one. And we'll go ahead and click OK. It's going to say these changes will take effect when the CSUP is restarted. That's fine. We're going to add a couple more devices underneath there. So I'll go ahead and insert another one. This will be our warehouse door number 1. And that is at 192.168.1.61. And we'll go ahead and click OK. And then finally, our cafeteria door, which is our 192.168.1.70 that we assigned an address to. And if you want to, you can put an additional description in here. Location you don't need to use. That was for another piece of software. And because these are RCO3s, which is the default, so we just need to leave that alone. When we do the IP bridge, we're going to have to change a couple more of these settings. This is an RCO3, so we'll just click OK. I'm going to go ahead and expand this supervisor here, and we can see that everything says inactive. Oh no, nothing's working. Just go ahead and stop your supervisor and restart it. And we'll just give it a few seconds for everything to come up online. Click refresh, and now we can see everything is operating properly in local mode and the door shows closed. Perfect. Now we just need to add in our IP bridge. So I'm going to go ahead and right click under the supervisor and click insert. We'll do Office Door Number 2. Now we want to choose IP bridge. So I put in my IP bridge, and then I want to make sure that it has the correct unit. This is going to be unit 1, or the first port on the IP bridge. My IP bridge is at .1.63, and the first unit stays at port 1001. So you just need to make sure that you choose the model for the IP bridge, and that you have the correct unit, and we'll see in the second device where we change the unit and the port number. And we'll click OK. And then we'll add in our second port, which is going to be our warehouse door number 2. Again, IP bridge. This is unit 2, but it's also port 10,002 with the same IP address. Same IP address, multiple TCP port connections. If this was an IP bridge 3, you would choose IP bridge 3, and then for your third port, you would do unit 3, and you would use port 1003. Now that those are set up, go ahead and click OK. Expand this out, and again, they're not communicating, so we got to restart that CSUP. Give it a second to refresh here, and our devices are up online. That's all there is to it. We have our devices up and online, communicating with DB Crystal. In the next course, we'll talk about more of the configuration settings on the device, and also how to get some people added in the system and get some badges working. So let's review our course objectives. We talked about addressing and communication of Isonas devices to both DB Crystal and Pure Access. DB Crystal works best with static addresses and in server mode. Pure Access works best with DHCP addresses and client mode. We covered controller supervisors for DB Crystal, what their purpose is and how to create them. Their purpose is to communicate with Isonas devices on the network. Also remember to spread your devices out over multiple CSUPs. Don't create one CSUP and put 100 or 50 doors underneath one controller supervisor. We covered the DB plug-and-play utility, the configuration tool, and the basic configuration of an Isonas device. Thank you for watching this video, and we hope it was beneficial. Have a great day.